What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. In a time when transatlantic bonds feel more fragile than ever, Donald Trump's second presidency has once again rattled the globe order. At first there were the rumors of halting military aid to Ukraine, scaling back intelligence cooperation, and dialing down the American footprint in NATO. All of that, happening in just the first few weeks, already sends a chill through European capitals. What was even more frightening is how easily the new American administration can fulfill their promises, and that these were not just mere words. They actually did it. Though for a very short period of time. Then the military aid, as we all know, resumed. As a result, obviously, the European leadership can no longer confidently assume that Uncle Sam will save them from every threat lurking on the horizon. At the Munich Security Conference, J.D. Vance openly criticized Europeans for relying too heavily on the US resources. Secretary of Defense Peter Hegseth hammered home a similar point, pointing to border security back home as the new American obsession and focus. Meanwhile, Trump had that tense Oval Office exchange with Ukraine's President Zelensky, as we all know, making it clear that Washington might not have the patience to keep paying the bill.
Yes, you will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that.
That's
Remember
exactly what
this. You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
If you live in Europe or care even a bit about international affairs, you probably sense that this could reshape everything you thought was carved in stone. Everything that was taken for granted for generations suddenly became not so obvious. That supposed ironclad American safety net, where the US basically guaranteed Europeans security, now looks increasingly fragile. So the obvious question here arises: how is Europe going to respond? In the old days, talk about the European Union forging a mighty defense structure of its own sounded like a fantasy or at least a half-thought idea. After all, the entire idea about creating the European Union was to never get back to war times and make such activities extremely costly and unattractive. Yet, these days, we are seeing radical proposals. From nuclear umbrellas, courtesy of President of France Emmanuel Macron, to massive rearmament schemes pushed by the European Commission. People once dismissive of these ideas are suddenly forced to take them seriously. Because with Trump turning his attention mostly to American internal problems, well, there might be no choice, simple as that. Europe once again has to urgently arm itself and prepare for potential military intervention. Because it is better to be prepared and not need to use all that knowledge and equipment, rather than being caught completely off guard and destroyed in days by a specially carefully planned special military operation. Less than a month ago, if someone had told you that France would even think about offering its nuclear umbrella to the entire European Union, you might have called it absurd. Makes sense, right? But this is exactly what President Emmanuel Macron has proposed.
Has become a threat to France and Europe. I want to believe that the US will stand by us, but we have to be ready if this is not the case.
France is the only EU nation with nuclear arms, and Emmanuel Macron is now opening a debate on extending its so-called nuclear umbrella over European allies.
And it's not just a wild rumor in some corner of dark web social media, some conspiracy theorists. The guy actually addressed this head-on, suggesting that if the necessity arises, the French nuclear arsenal could extend its protective wings over all European countries that want this kind of protection. Since the United Kingdom left, France remains the only nuclear-armed state in the bloc, which places it in a uniquely awkward yet very powerful position. Now you might say, wait, what about countries like Austria or Switzerland that made a reputation for themselves for being neutral? Well, that's exactly the puzzle, the question. Macron's plans test the boundaries of what Europeans can agree on. In Eastern Europe, some leaders wonder if a French-led deterrent can really replace the old American guarantee. Because, let's be honest, many nations in that part of the continent have spent decades trusting Washington's might. Handing the final say on nuclear weapons to Paris might not be their dream scenario. Yet, as Trump signals that America's priorities lie elsewhere, the conversations will once again gain momentum. And you cannot also ignore the moral and strategic weight. This is not just about passing around guns and shells. Nuclear weapons carry the gravest responsibility. Even discussing them reawakens old fears from the Cold War. But for Macron, it is better to deal with those fears rather than pretending the old status quo is still intact. If the United States is pivoting away, Europe needs its own big stick, or so the argument goes. Sure, it raises concerns about sovereignty, who decides when or if that nuclear button is pushed. But in a moment of crisis, there might be no better deterrent than the vow that Europe can defend itself without begging for the US bombs or intervention. While Macron's nuclear talks made headlines, another bombshell dropped when the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, introduced the ReArm, Europe's rearmament program. A program worth hundreds of billions of dollars, requiring impeccable cooperation between more than 24 European countries. And, well, not all of them unconditionally supporting Ukraine.
I presented the ReArm Europe plan today to the leaders. A plan to give Europe the military capability that it needs to face today's threats. It could mobilize up to 800 billion euros.
If you rolled your eyes the moment you heard about it, we get you, don't worry. The European Union has a reputation for drowning everything in bureaucratic sludge. But hold on, because ReArm proposes something drastically different. It calls for a massive infusion of funds, $150 billion to be specific, or more to begin with, to strengthen air and missile defense, artillery, drones, and more. Some estimate the final cost of a program to be at least $800 billion, around the same as the entire defense budget of the United States. It also lowers the usual budgetary red tape, letting countries run higher deficits if they are used for boosting defenses. This idea shook the corridors of Brussels and beyond. For example, Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk, known for his pointed opinions, even spoke about outpacing Russia in a new arms race. That might sound alarming, yet from the perspective of those who feel threatened by Moscow's unpredictability, it is also a very logical stance. Meanwhile, Germany's most probable next Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, is pushing to practically double the defense allocation, a big leap for a nation traditionally allergic to militarism, especially since, as you would have guessed it, World War II.
500 billion euros would be borrowed to fix infrastructure, and that strict government debt rules could be eased to increase the military budget.
But pouring money into defense is no magic wand. You cannot just do it. Coordinating so many nations with different military doctrines, procurement systems, and hardware is no small task. Just think about it. The last time Europe tried anything remotely similar, it ended up entrangled in committees, subcommittees, and so much red tape that the actual results, if any, took forever to materialize. I mean, try to get the approval of 24 different countries and you'll see what we mean. Yet many leaders argue that letting that old bureaucracy paralyze everything is too risky in a world where the United States might just wave goodbye and say, just handle it your own problems yourself. If ReArm works as advertised, Europe could start building a real deterrent that does not depend on transatlantic phone call to the White House. However, cynics believe it might be too little too late. Because if the American wind changes direction faster than Europe can unify, then no plan, no matter how many billions are poured into it, will be ready in time. Others point to a different fear, that a massive defense build-up could escalate tensions rather than protect against them. But in the eyes of ReArm's supporters, any risk is preferable to waiting around in a world where an emboldened adversary might test Europe's resolve the moment they sense American hesitation. Of course, if you have ever followed European politics, you know it is not just this one big happy family. The Commission, the Parliament and the Council each have their own sets of rules, interests and alliances. Even when they agree on a shared goal, like say guaranteeing stable cheese prices or pay attention, this is real, or determining the appropriate curve of the cucumber. All these are real things, just. And it took hundreds of hours discussions in European Parliament. You can Google it. Well, they can spend years bogged down in contradictory amendments and footnotes. Now imagine transferring all that chaos to the realm of military strategy, nuclear umbrellas, and arms races. It is not exactly a very minor tweak to the policy, right? On the other hand, countries like Hungary under Viktor Orban have shown a willingness to cozy up to Russia, at least in terms of rhetorical support or trade deals. Meanwhile, the Baltic states or Poland see Russia as an immediate threat. Trying to harmonize these opposing views into one cohesive defense policy, it is almost comedic, unfortunately. Then there is the matter of actual logistics. If the European Union invests heavily in new missiles or artillery, can all member states align on standard calibers, supply lines, training regiments, and similar? Where will they train? Are countries prepared to receive foreign soldiers on their soil, even though just for a joint military exercise? Or will they each do their own thing, eventually turning the rearm initiative into a massive, never-ending paperwork? There is also the question of how quickly any of this can happen. War, or at least the threat of war, does not pose for committee votes. Europe spent decades learning on the comfort that if things got truly dire, the United States Navy or Air Force would swoop in immediately, almost. With that assumption fading, the European Union must figure out how to adapt to a pace that might not be in this comfort zone. That's why each new step, from a nuclear debate to a defense budget hike, is seasoned with extreme urgency. The question is whether that urgency can cut through layers of red tape before a real crisis erupts. Because once again, the entire goal of European Union's existence is to make war as unattractive as possible. And under normal circumstances, everyone would prefer the sound of paper rustling, being stapled and passed around, rather than the sounds of missiles and drones flying above people's heads. We might be tempted to draw parallels to the 1930s, but let's not oversimplify, at least for now. Back then, appeasement turned disastrous, and only the massive intervention by the United States tipped the scales. Today, the US is signaling a step back, at least from Europe's vantage point, throwing the European Union into territory that feels both new and eerie old. Leaders like Tusk or Macron argue that a self-reliant and stronger Europe might finally emerge, precisely because it learned not to rely on outside help. Others worry that without America, the entire alliance system in Europe could fail. There is also the possibility that building up these huge arsenals might push Europe towards a more aggressive stance. Traditionally, Europe prided itself on using trade and diplomacy to keep peace. And now, with talk of nuclear umbrellas and rearmament, we see a side of Europe that's more hawkish, way more. Realpolitik, they say, is not for the faint of heart. If Russia or any other power senses that Europe is not fully unified or prepared, it could exploit those cracks. In that sense, the Union might argue that rearmament is purely defensive. But from an outside perspective, an arms race is still an arms race, no matter how it is justified. And let's not forget that Trump's administration pivot away from Europe does not necessarily mean the US is dropping all responsibilities. It might just be that the White House believes Europe can handle more on its own, so it is time to just let them. Whether that fosters a more mature European defense identity or just leaves a vacuum that no one can adequately fill is a very big question. Historians might look back one day and call this specific moment the crucial fork in the road, where Europe either rose to the occasion or discovered the limits of its unity. Who knows, maybe just like a 30-year-old son living comfortably in the attic of his parents and who needs to be pushed out to face the real world with its hardships and problems in order to become a self-sufficient person, so is Europe, that needs to go through times of militaristic uncertainty in order to discover its true potential and strength. Well, there you have it, guys. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. If you wish to support my work, there are links down below. Thanks so much for watching. See you tomorrow.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.